Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the one-year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety and Wendy Korbusieski, and we're looking at a passage from Matthew chapter 26, verses 51 through 58. It says, "But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear. 'Put away your sword,' Jesus told him. 'Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now?' And then verse 58 says, 'Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and came to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and sat with the guards and waited to see how it would all end.'" So this is one of the more dramatic moments in the arrest of Jesus. And it's interesting to notice the difference between Peter's response here, his reaction here, and then later his denials of Jesus. Why do you think he boldly defends Jesus here, but he acts like a coward later?
First, I want to say that the Gospel of Matthew does not specifically state that it was Peter who cut the man's ear off, but we do learn that later in the Gospel of John. But as it was him, I think that it demonstrates, when you're talking about one situation against another, I think it demonstrates the complexity of our human emotion, how we can go from one extreme to another. It seems that Peter is driven by his impulse and his anger when Jesus was arrested. And I think that in a situation like this, it can be easy for us to confuse this as courage, when he may have just been being impulsive.
Right.
He wanted to protect Jesus. He knew this. He felt that this should not be happening. And later, when Peter was sitting in the courtyard of the high priest's place, the reality of this situation must have really begun to weigh on his mind, when fear then became the greater motivator for the way that he chose to respond to that situation.
The longer you sit with something, those types of ruminating emotions like fear tend to take over, whereas anger tends to be much more impulsive.
Right.
What stood out to me in this passage is how we could see, Sunday we talked about conflict resolution, and how there are some examples or some demonstrations of conflict resolution. We don't normally look at this passage as resolving conflict, but Wendy, tell us a little bit more about the angle of conflict resolution.
There's like two different kinds of conflict resolution going on here. One aspect of that is like this conflict that Jesus and Peter both have with the whole arrest situation going on. So first, if you look at Jesus's reaction to the arrest, number one, he was responding through the lens of God's will. He knew the necessity of the suffering. He knew what the will of God was. He knew he had to suffer. He knew he had to die in order to accomplish his will. And so his reaction to that conflict at that moment was different than Peter's, because Peter's reaction was, I think, how we all would have reacted. It was that human knee-jerk impulse kind of thing, where you were not thinking about God's plan. You're just thinking about how to defend, how to save, how to just escape, or, that fight or flight. And he was ready to fight at that moment. So there was that conflict going on, how to respond in the heat of that moment. And then, choosing which lens to look through. But there's also conflict development-wise, there's this conflict going on, this tension that was building between Jesus and Peter, just the two of them. Because the act that Peter did with the lopping off the ear, it's like one of those steps in this series of events that's going to lead to Peter's denial that Jesus told him was going to happen. And that denial just leads to this estrangement, and then there's kind of this breaking of a relationship almost between Jesus and Peter, this estrangement, this hurt But Jesus knew it was coming. He told him it was coming. And he chose to love him through it. You know, even though he told Peter it was coming, it still caught Peter, I think, by surprise.
Don't it always do?
It shocked
Right. I
him.
mean, don't we always feel shocked when we finally do it?
Right, because I would never do that. I wouldn't do that. And then you do it. But Jesus saw it coming, and he chose to love him through it, kind of coach him through it anyway. And so you got, those two kind of conflicts going on anyway. And there's some lessons to learn.
Yeah, I mean, there's
conflicts.
a lot of tension present. And to be able to see Jesus kind of keep his cool in the midst of that is a model for us. I think there are some things we can learn, from that.
Right.
Right. And it's not always easy to do. Right. So one of the things we can learn is that we have to look at every situation through the lens of God's sovereignty.
Right.
But I don't know how y'all manage that. But in conflict,
that's hard.
That is rarely rising to the top of mind.
Yeah. That's not one of those, natural. That's not a human reaction. That's a trained reaction. Yeah. That's one you have to train your flesh to do, because that is not going to be one that comes naturally.
I was just listening to this podcast yesterday, and they were interviewing a couple who'd been married for 50-some years. He's been a pastor for 40-some years. And one of the questions was about conflict resolution and a particular situation, how they responded to one another. And he said that he had learned that the way you respond in a situation like that is less about who you are and what your human nature tells you to do, and more about your sanctification process. So you can't ever expect for yourself to have that response. But if you've been letting God continually work in you, if you do have that response, it still wasn't yours. It was just the fact that he has changed that in you.
When we're able to see God's sovereignty and how it influences, if it influences how we respond, it keeps us from responding so impulsively, and to do more so in faith.
Right.
Because impulsive responses are dangerous. The first week when we talked about communication, he says human anger doesn't produce the righteousness God desires. Our emotions can derail conflict resolution quickly
in a minute.
And once emotions are inserted into the situation, it's nearly impossible to remove them. Now you can pause, take a break, come back after you've had a chance to think it through, but it is very, very difficult to de-escalate something that emotions has escalated. He knew what Peter was going to do, but he still responded in patience. That's also tough to do. Somebody they're getting ready to betray you, hurt you, walk away from you. It's tough to be able to keep it in check, because part of you, when you're like, it's getting ready to happen, right? This person's going to.
You're watching the train wreck.
Yeah, well, in his case, he was going to knife him in the back.
Yeah.
He was going to betray him. Part of you wants to say, just push him even harder, right? Let's just make this worse. But that wasn't Jesus' response. I said part of you wants to do that, right? Maybe it's just part of me. I don't know. But so let's talk about some questions here. It seems almost impossible to be in the midst of a conflict and hold on to this perspective that God is in control. So in those tough moments, how do you remind yourself that God's in control?
It really does help to stop and pray, because when you do feel emotional or hurt, you're inside of your own head and you are trying to figure out how to control it. And I think if I can stop and physically say, like, I need your help, I need you to take control of this situation, it seems to help change my frame of mind too. Because ultimately, I think that helps us realize that it is a temporary situation. Talking about understanding his scope and the bigger picture. I think sometimes it feels big and it's really small.
Right. And it's normally in those situations where you have no control anyway.
No.
It's those things that you can't fix yourself. And so there's nothing you could do about it anyway. I find myself, I just have to physically stop and take a breath. My wiring is a peacemaker. That's how I am made up. So I'm going to look for the silver lining. I'm going to try to look for the bright side. I'm going to try to find the best of the situation and try to paint it. I'm crying on the inside, but I'm just going to try to. And then when all else fails, I have a meltdown. And, and I just, but then I have to pick myself up and get over it. Then, grab myself by the shoulders and just like, you idiot, get over yourself. And take a breath and like, he's got it. It'll be okay. I was listening to Mark Driscoll a couple weeks ago, and he had a message. He was talking about his kids when his kids got frustrated or angry, situations that were going on, even like choices in their household. And this is what, of course, when his kids were younger in their home, it became a thing in their home, and then it became a running joke. Their response to those situations was, "Well, it's better than hell." That was their response, or I don't like the choice. What's for dinner? Spaghetti. Well, it's better than hell. And so that's how they just responded to those kind of things. So I guess, that could be your new thing. If you don't like what's going on, well, it's better than hell. Okay, we'll take it.
How did Peter's reaction and then his later denials of Jesus eventually work out in God's plan? How do you see those as pieces of God's plan?
The number one thing that comes to my mind is the fact that it initiated this posture of humility in Peter, because he had promised to stand by Jesus, and then all of a sudden he had done the absolute opposite. But it created in him this understanding of the humility that he felt in his shame, but also the humility that he felt and how Jesus then treated him after he had denied him like that. And I think him beginning to understand that depth and richness of love that Jesus had for him, despite his actions, really began to set him up well for the ministry that he was going to have him do, like you said, in the big picture, even after Jesus's death. And I also think, this sounds like a given, but it preserved Peter's life, because we don't know, had he said, "You're right, I am one of his disciples," like, would he have been on the cross beside him? I don't know. We don't know how that would have turned out, but it seems likely because they were out for blood, right?
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it from there. In my mind, I was thinking through the same path you did, that Peter needed to experience God's unconditional reconciliation, like to understand the full measure of God's character in a real and personal way. It's one thing to offer lip service to that, but to understand redemption on a personal, intimate level in order to be able to share that so boldly, as he did later, required that kind of experience. And so it was a process he had to walk through. But that's a cool perspective to think, if he had said, "Yes, I know him. He's my best friend. He's the savior of the world," he may have very well had been on the cross beside him.
this challenge to figure out, the sovereignty of God and how His plan comes to pass, and then just really what are in a moment things that are struggles. I don't disagree that it shaped him. It had an impact on him. But it's both things seem to be problems that may follow him even later. So I can give you an example. That denying who Jesus was, right? He wanted who was in front of him to accept him right at that particular moment. That seems to be his motivation. If you go later, Paul will confront him because when the Jews are not around, he's eating with the Gentiles. But when the Gentiles come around, he only eats with the Jews. When the Jews come around, he ignores the Gentiles. And Paul's like, hey, you're being hypocritical here, right? And so Peter had two issues. He was impulsive, and I don't know that he was a peacemaker. I don't know that would be how I would describe him, but he certainly wanted to be.
Maybe he's a people pleaser.
Yeah, he certainly was a people pleaser and wanted to be accepted by the people who were in front of him. Right. And they seemed to come out all at one time. In this case, because tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about, his repentance about it. But, I think it wells up in him. It becomes forefront. And that's one of the things I think conflict in general will do, is it will raise the issues that most need to be dealt with in our life, right? It'll pull them it'll pull them right out front and center for you to be able to see them and be able to deal with them. Have you ever had conflicts in relationships that turned out to fit into God's perfect plan?
I mean, I personally don't know if I can recall a time that I felt like, oh, this fits perfectly into God's plan for my life when I was going through it. But I do think that I can see on the other side of it how it turned out for good, despite how it may have felt.
I got a couple I'm waiting on.
To see if it'll turn out for
see how this is turning out in God's plan.
Don't we all? Oh, yeah. We're walking in that in-between all the time.
I can give a couple of examples. I could think of a couple of examples that I'm going to use one in particular, and I need to keep it as generic as possible for the sake of everybody involved. But a situation arose with staff member, and they didn't deal with it very wisely, and there was not a lot I could do about it, in the moment. They were just made some unwise choices, but I didn't go out and try to fix it, this has been years ago, so it's not like it's something recent. It's been years ago. I didn't go out and try to fix it or correct people's view of the situation. I just, let it lay. And a few years passed, and then that person ended up back here, not as a staff member, but just they randomly came in on a Sunday, and then were able to be here for a period of time. And anyway, they sat down, wanted to sit down and have a conversation with me, and they, apologized about how it had turned out and what had happened, and it was a wonderful, at least from my perspective, it was a wonderful opportunity for healing to take place in that relationship with that person. But the thing that I thought in that moment, and I still believe today, if I had gotten ticked off and allowed my emotions to wind up in that situation and go out and fight fire with fire, because that is my natural instinct. And they would have never have been able to do that. I would have shut the door forever for there to be any reconciliation in that relationship. And I, I'm friends with this person. We're able to have a relationship together, but I've seen how God has worked in their life. I've seen things I've learned from that myself. But I've noticed how one of the mistakes we make is we leave no room for reconciliation because we draw such strong lines in the sand and make such declarations that, then there can't be any reconciliation. Had Jesus drawn lines in the sand and made declarations of, well, if you can't tell them who I am, forget you, right? We would miss a lot. Who preaches on the day of Pentecost, right? I mean, there's so many questions then that get answered, and so I think about things like that, conflicts that I've had in relationships, where if you burn all of the bridges, there's no pathway to reconcile. I don't want to say you remove God from being able to work in the situation, but I will go as far as to say you make it more difficult for him to work in that situation.
I think it's good to be able to look at things from a bigger perspective. And it's also really good for us to be able to look back, like we were talking about earlier, and say, hey, I remember how that felt, but it doesn't seem like that big of a deal now. And I'm so glad that I decided that I wanted to keep the relationship worse than I wanted to win the fight.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.